what the audacity for
Mm-hmm.
this playwright and for the characters in the show to suggest maybe forgiveness might be a good thing when this terrible, terrible thing has happened, is a I think a really important and meaningful story to be telling.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to No Script, an unscripted conversation about theater's best scripts. I'm Jackson Nickolay.
And I'm Hannah Barker Nickolay.
Yes, welcome, Hannah, to the show.
Hello.
Hello. If that moment surprised you, as normally Jacob Mann Christensen comes on at this point of the show and says his name, etc., then well, surprise. We have reached one of the hallmarks of the show, one of the kind of waystones of our season, and that is the special guest episode. Here at the second to last episode of the season, we're having Hannah Barker Nickolay on the show, and as you've probably smoothly deduced, by virtue of the shared last name, there's some relation there, and that is that Hannah and I are married.
Indeed, that is true.
I'm super excited to have you on the show because it's been a while. We're at season 10, and you've been along for the ride of the show, but haven't been in it yet. And you're I want to just give you a chance to introduce yourself just a little bit and some of your theater stuff that you do, and just other than us being married, how you've wound up on the show today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I'm Hannah. I have an undergraduate degree in theater from Northwestern College in Orange City, Iowa. I grew up in a very theater-y family, so I have been watching plays and been involved with plays basically for as long as I can remember. I sort of inherited that from my parents, who were both theater professors. But when I sort of started to make it my own, another thing that I really love is poetry, and performance poetry kind of became a thing that I dabbled in and claimed a little bit more as the area that I'm passionate about and excited about. And so I do poetry, I do theater. Yes, I had an end of that thought and it left me. So I'm really excited to be here talking about this script today. Theater's awesome, and at this particular moment in my life, I don't get to be super active, even though I have been very active in the past. So I'm excited to be here today.
Yeah, super excited to have you, theater. We met each other. Here's your cutesy story for the day. We met each other on a traveling theater troupe. So, really excited to have you on the show. And we're going to be talking about a play that actually you selected today that you kind of brought to our attention. We're talking today, if you haven't already noticed in the title of this podcast, we're talking about Frozen by Bryony Lavery today. And I want to just give you a chance at the start of the show, without getting too much into like the play itself so far. Why did this play stand out to you as a play that you wanted to talk about on the show?
Yeah, for sure. That's such a good question. I'm trying to figure out how to answer it without talking about the play.
You can talk about it a little bit. We almost always give away more than we intend at the beginning.
Perfect. So being a poetry person, this is one of those plays that on the page is formatted in a more poetic format. You wouldn't necessarily know that if you were watching this play, but I think that the playwright chose to do that. It just offers the actors and the director and the designers an interesting opportunity to interact with those line breaks and things that they use in a particular way and let that inform the choices they make as designers and performers. So a little bit of that. And also one other thing that I really love about the script is the way that they tell the story is sort of via monologue. It's these three characters that sort of you weave in and out of each person's story, but they are connected, eventually become more connected, which is just a mode of storytelling that I really love. So that's a little bit about why I chose this particular script today.
Yeah, thanks so much for bringing it. I'm excited about the kind of poetry aspect of it, both because of your expertise in poetry, but also the way that we often talk about on the show that we obviously read the scripts for each of the shows.
Mm-hmm.
And while theater, of course, is meant to be seen, is meant to be on its feet and embodied, the act of reading plays is awesome. And so a play like this that really takes advantage of the layout and the poetry of words is an exciting play to get to talk about. So thank you for bringing it to our attention.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity to.
Yeah, of course. I do want right away at the start of the show. I think I'll just get this out of the way right away at the beginning. This is a play about a pretty sensitive topic.
Mm-hmm.
This play, if you know anything about Frozen, you kind of know some of it. We'll get into the synopsis and stuff later, but just wanted to give a quick content warning at the get go of this play. This is a play that deals with serial killers. This is a play that deals with sexual abuse. This is a play that deals with violence. And this is a play that deals with pretty significant grief and the process and the various ways that forgiveness and blame and all of these things play into that process. So if those sorts of things. Oh, also another part of the content is also this play deals with the issue of suicide as well. So if that kind of scope of topic is not what you have signed up for today, that's a-okay. You can listen to any of the other episodes of the season, or just wait till another day to engage this podcast, because Hannah's not on any of those episodes, and it'll be fun to hear what she has to say. So just starting out, be warned, if that's not what you're wanting to hear today, maybe pick another day to listen to it. But we're going to jump into the conversation. Before we do, though, as is our normal practice on the show, we want to take just a second and say thank you to all of our patrons over at patreon.com/noscriptpodcast for being patrons of the show. Thank you all so much. It means so much to have you be a part of these seasons, to be a part of the themed months and the special guest episodes. They're only possible because of our patrons over at patreon.com/noscriptpodcast. Whether you're a longtime listener to the show or whether you're just tuning into this one because Hannah's on it, you may have heard that while we love getting to have these conversations, love getting to talk about scripts, love getting to talk about a wide variety of scripts, it is not a free endeavor. There are some costs associated with both the recording of a show, the hosting of a show, time into that, and also the purchasing of scripts and things like that. And the patrons make it possible for us to do. So if you're looking for a way to help out the show, if you're looking for a way just to get involved more in the show, head on over to Patreon and see the various options we have. For as low as $1, $12 over the course of the year, we've committed to that amount. You can really help out the show a lot, and you'll find that $1 tier over there, access to patron-only posts, and then a bunch of other tiers as well for other rewards and things like that. But looking for a way to help out the show, that's the way to do it. Thank you to all of our patrons who have already become patrons of the show. Head on over to patreon.com/noscriptpodcast, and we will see you over there. And now, back to the script. This is always a fun part of the guest episodes. You get to see Jacob or I do kind of 90% of our run through comments at the start of the show.
It's delightful,
which is fun. We're just going to jump into the context of this show a little bit. Hannah has gamely volunteered to give us the synopsis, so you won't have to listen to me for the whole intro to the show here. But I am just going to give you a little bit of introduction into this play that we're talking about today. We're talking about Frozen, again, by Bryony Lavery. And Bryony Lavery is a really, I believe this is the first time we're talking about her play on the show. She's a British dramatist. Her most well-known play is Frozen, the one that we're talking about today. However, I believe she has, I think 40 is the number I saw, 40 other plays that she has written. She's a very prolific playwright. Has kind of continued to write about or wrote before the writing of Frozen and continued to write after. Her most recent productions, other than Frozen, are plays like The Believers, plays like she's done a number of stage adaptations as well. She's done A Christmas Carol, Treasure Island, Brighton Rock, Lovely Bones, a large assortment of these plays, and I'll eventually talk about the National Theatre just a little bit, as that's the one, the theatre in England, in London, that put on this show eventually. But she's continued that relationship with the National Theatre with plays like Treasure Island being produced there. So, great playwright for that, UK-based playwright. She also has a 2007 translation of Chekhov's Uncle Vanya. So all sorts of good stuff there. I'm going to talk just a little bit about this play in particular. Frozen is the play that we're talking about today. It's a play from originally 1998. That's kind of the inception of the show. That first kind of production of this show took place at the Birmingham Repertory Theatre. It won the Best Play Award from the Theatrical Management Association in that year, and then it continued to kind of be worked on and produced eventually in 2002 at the National Theatre's Cotslow Theatre, which I believe I've seen a play in. I can't quite remember, but I've seen a couple of shows at the National Theatre, and it's fun to kind of make that connection. It then opened off Broadway in February of 2004 at the Manhattan Class Company Theater. And that production was nominated for a Tony Award for Best Play, and it won a Tony Award for Best Featured Actor. So this play was very well lauded at that time. And interestingly, I did just, in the kind of researching of this play, part of this play's story is that Bryony Lavery kind of rode out some accusations of plagiarism around this play. And it kind of occurred right after that Broadway production. This, I'm not going to spend too much time on it in this podcast because I think it's going to take us away from the actual content of the script to talk about it. But it's well documented. Interestingly, it's kind of wrapped up with Malcolm Gladwell and some articles that he wrote. The charges of plagiarism were around these characters are not... it's kind of complicated. These characters are based upon real stories that Lavery interacted with. However, it's not in any way supposed to be a biography. These are not the names of the characters or in real life or anything like that. However, through the process of this investigation, it became clear that she was very inspired by a number of people. If you want to get into it, Gladwell has a number of great pieces. He has a New Yorker article about it. You can search it. Just search Malcolm Gladwell, Bryony Lavery. It's all going to come up. It's a really interesting kind of talk about how plagiarism exists. And Gladwell's take on it is really interesting and nuanced, and I'm not going to try to rehash it here. Ultimately, Gladwell came down mostly on Lavery's side of the issue, and the play continues to be produced regardless of those plagiarism charges and even transcends the kind of charges that were brought against it. The most recent production that I have on my list is from February 2018, and that was a revival at the Theatre Royal Haymarket. And I imagine I'd be really interested to kind of extend this invite out to more people in our No Script community. If you've seen this show, I imagine this play is a imminently producible show. There's some interesting work to do with dialect, I suppose. It is set in England, so you have to do that well. But it's a three-hander. It's a play that uses a lot of imaginative space, as Hannah said initially. There's some monologue work in it, and also kind of scene work as well. So it's a play that's very producible. A play that I'd be excited to see myself. So hit us up in any of the places that you interact with our show, and we'd love to keep talking about this play's producibility, because I think it's really, really producible and tells a really brave story, or a lot of back in 2002, when when it was being produced in the early aughts, people were saying how fresh and dangerous this play was. And I think some of that freshness, as more and more stories like the ones that are told in this one have been told since the early aughts. I don't think that decreases the visceralness and the dangerousness of this play. So, yeah, that's kind of been the scope of the play as it's been produced in the limited time we have to talk about it here today. And excited to jump into the synopsis.
Okay. I will give this my best shot.
You got it.
Okay. This is a play in 2 acts. It starts. No, here's how we'll do this. It starts with the 3 characters, their timelines. We'll call them timelines. Their stories are mostly separate. They don't interact with each other at the start, and then as the play progresses, their timelines and stories begin to interact a little bit more. So we'll give a sort of overview of the overarching story, and then I'll go a little bit more into each character's timeline. This is a play about 3 characters. Nancy, who is a mother. Ralph, who is the serial killing pedophile. And Agnetha, who is a psychologist. Yes, she's a psychologist from New York, who studies serial killers. And what happens in the show is Nancy's child, Rona, is abducted by Ralph, and is also killed by Ralph. And this is sort of the story of that happening, Ralph eventually being discovered and taken into prison, Agnetha coming to England to study Ralph and other serial killers like him. And let's see, there's just so many pieces, and it's not a plot-driven structure exactly, so bear with me as I try to weave all of this together. Nancy, the mom, starts going on this search for her daughter. She continues and continues. 20 years go by, and that's when Ralph is captured and arrested, sure, taken into custody.
Yeah. As a result of another, he tries to kidnap another girl. 20 years later, we don't know exactly how many other times he's succeeded since he captured Rona, but in this instance, he fails. He's picked up by police, and Nancy is notified by the police that they have captured him and have found what is likely Rona's remains in one of his sheds, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And then the rest of the play is sort of a story of Ralph being in prison, Nancy finding out, Nancy continuing to go through her grieving process, eventually encouraged by her other daughter to forgive Ralph, and going to the prison to forgive him. Meanwhile, Agnetha is continuing to study Ralph. We'll talk more about what she discovers later. Once Nancy has a conversation with Ralph, this change happens in Ralph. There is remorse that he finally shows, which eventually leads to his suicide. And then the final moment of the play is Nancy and Agnetha both at Ralph's funeral together. That ended up a little bit more detailed in the overarching story than I meant to go. But let's see. What I'm trying to think of beginning pieces of their stories that might be important as we head into this.
Yeah, yeah, nicely done. The synopsis is always hard to do. We're
Yeah.
flying through trying to like tell the whole story of what is a really in depth sort of play. Probably the other piece that I would want to kind of just note as we go in, Agnetha is kind of processing quite a bit as she arrives on the scene. The kind of opening moment that we see Agnetha on stage, she's clearly going through some stuff. She's trying to talk herself into leaving from New York to go to London. And what we find out through the course of the play is that her longtime partner, David, is the name that I wrote down. I forget the full name of the doctor, but her longtime partner David recently died.
Work partner.
Work partner, thank you. Yeah. Turns out more than just a work partner, though. Eventually, recently died in a car crash, in which she says at least that he was completely at fault. He was paying attention. He was buckled up. All the things. He just died as a runaway truck hit him. And 2 days prior, they had an affair together. He was a married man, and they've been partners for a long time. 10 years, I think, is talked about as the length of their partnership. And right before he died, they had this affair, and she is kind of going through the process of grief around that as well, as she engages Ralph's story, as she engages Nancy's story. So that is a lot of the content of that last scene at the funeral, is her revealing some of that information. We don't find out a lot of this information all the way until the end of the play. But yeah, so all of these characters are kind of going through, yeah, just a whole lot of unpacking through the play.
Yeah, like their own grief journeys for some for different things, but they each go on very different grief journeys, which I think is one of the really cool things about this play, is to watch those happen parallelly.
Yeah, and it's one of the like scarier parts of this
Yes.
play
Oh,
too, because
absolutely.
yeah, we're on board with Nancy's grief journey for sure. That feels absolutely applicable. We are even accustomed to the narrative of having an affair and losing the person quickly. That's a grief story we are familiar with. I think the dangerous part of this play, what people have said is dangerous, is engaging Ralph's story, which
Mm.
is this individual who does an absolutely reprehensible thing,
Hmm.
and then Agnetha showing up and trying to understand why, and by extension, the audience, us, hearing some of the why.
Hmm.
And some of the pain of his story, etc., all while not shying away ever from the fact that this was awful, irreprehensible, and how do we grapple with this in this person?
Hmm. Yeah. And I think one of the other interesting parts of Ralph's story, or maybe another dangerous part of Ralph's story, is um, like the longing for justice by the family members who have gone through all of this pain. Um, like, we understand that, right? There's no question in anyone's head that they deserve justice. Their stories, the little one that they lost, they're like, part of our longing is that there be some sort of recompense for this terrible thing that was done. Um, and the big question of the play that Agnetha's storyline really pushes is, um, what happens in Ralph's past that in his own childhood, that actually changes his brain chemistry, so that he almost, like he didn't have a choice to become who he became. But for this play to propose even the idea of forgiveness being an important part of Nancy's journey, an important part of Ralph's journey, and even Agnetha as she studies serial killers and what happens and what changes go on in people's brains when things like their previous trauma happens to them. It just, like, forgiveness on that level is so massive, and so painful, and we hope ultimately healing. We think that it is for Nancy in the end, but my goodness, uh, what the audacity for
Mhm.
this playwright and for the characters in this show to suggest maybe forgiveness might be a good thing when this terrible, terrible thing has happened, is a, I think, a really important and meaningful story to be telling, especially honestly right now.
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree. The way that yeah, the way this is a play about forgiveness, and that forgiveness, the route to forgiveness is is interesting, because it's also a play about being frozen in a moment prior to that. To borrow, like, there's the play's title. Actually, we don't often like lean as heavily into the title as I think I'm about to on this podcast, but the title of this play is really apt because each of these characters are kind of frozen in something that throughout the play moves them towards the opportunity to forgive. Interestingly, I don't know that they all take themselves up on the opportunity to forgive, which I'd be interested in your thoughts on, and I'll just kind of briefly lay out
Yes.
some of that because it is a play about forgiveness for sure, and I think Nancy's journey is clearest in the kind of typical structure of that. She goes on the journey of loss, of anger, of wanting multiple times. Both her and her husband Bob like just say we want to kill this person. We can't forgive them for what they did, and she eventually gets the meeting with him, goes about the process of a really hard meeting, and moves through forgiveness, even though it's hard and complicated and not it's not like all great at the end either. It's still really fraught. But that kind of move away from frozenness in her life is really evident as a result of that. She freezes Rona's room
Hmm.
in time. She freezes her relationships with her daughter and her husband, all until she finds out that Rona has been brought back, or not brought back, has been found.
Yeah.
Um, and then it's the slow thaw of that starts to unfreeze
Yeah.
her.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. That's a great way to describe what Nancy specifically goes through there. Yeah.
Yeah. And so her journey of unfrozenness into forgiveness is really clear. Agatha's is interesting though, because she's frozen in this moment before that she left. And some of her process is giving herself
Mm.
forgiveness.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if she quite makes it. Like I think her path to forgiveness is kind of that final scene that you described earlier where she's finally confesses to Nancy because she needed to confess to someone that she had this affair with her work partner. Um, that sort of feels like the beginning of her journey that she has named, that, or just like admitted to someone that she did this thing. Um, and Nancy has this just gut wrenching line, sort of throws Agnetha's
Yeah.
research
Mm-hmm.
words back at her, um, where it's this line where Agnetha describes the difference between, oh, what is it? An act. Jackson, your brain is better at remembering lines.
Yeah. The crimes of evil and crimes
Yes,
of illness.
yes. Thank
Yeah.
you. That crimes of evil have like sort of you're conscious of what you're doing and you choose to do it anyway. Crimes of illness is more, uh, you honestly had no choice to be like there, like the way that you were formed there. Your brain didn't have access to another choice to make. And what Nancy says to Agnetha at the end is, you know what you were doing. You you have to hold it. You have to suffer. It's not gonna get better.
Yeah.
Which is,
Brutal.
ugh, oh, it's
Ooh.
so brutal. Oh my gosh. Oh, it's so brutal. And I'm just so curious what her journey is going to be like after this play ends. Will she ever be able to get to a point of self forgiveness? I don't know. And I don't know that the play invites us to think that she will eventually forgive herself. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it kind of leaves it in that liminal, not really sure sort of moment of their final conversation together. Um, yeah, yeah, yeah. It'd be interesting to kind of check back in with Agnetha someday,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of see what has come about. But that's kind of the nature of theater too. You don't get the sequel.
I know.
You
Yeah.
just get to talk about
Most
it.
of the time.
Yeah, most of the time. Yeah, that's true. To kind of wrap up this theme of frozenness, we got to talk about Ralph then in that equation too,
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely.
because his frozenness is kind of born out of this trauma that he's had. Some of it is like physical trauma, like having fallen multiple times and hit his head, also
Mm-hmm.
been like hit by family members before. We
Yep.
piece together his story. He's a very the way this character is written is a very magnetic person, and also a person who doesn't. It's really hard to get a hold on.
Mm-hmm.
So we piece together some of his story from his conversations with Agnetha, and it's clear that he suffered physical, likely some sort of sexual abuse when he was young.
Probably a lot
Um,
of neglect too.
Yep. Yep. And then also had these kind of multiple head trauma sorts of moments. So that's all part of this sort of complicated morass that the playwright gives us, that Lavery gives us as this person who is frozen in those moments, frozen in those or in the consequences of those moments,
Mm-hmm.
and is thus able to do these reprehensible things without um, connecting to the reprehensiveness of it. In
Yeah.
fact, at one point, he says he straight up wishes they were legal.
Yeah. Oh, that's one of like the most terrifying things he says when he's with another person is, "I just wish it were legal," and Agnes is like, "What?" And he's like, "Yeah, to kill children. I wish it were legal." And it's like, "Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
how do you, what?" Yeah, it's.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a rough this play is rough in some segments, especially kind of sitting in the room anytime Ralph is on stage. There's lots of, so there's the way he treats Agnetha,
Mm-hmm.
very predatory in his behavior. um so then watching his journey of unfrozenness
Mm-hmm.
um starts with Nancy, the conversation with Nancy.
Yeah.
It's not almost certainly, actually, I'll say Agnetha's talking with him kind of tease him up for the moment with Nancy.
Yeah.
But it's Nancy that actually like gets him to register something. And the last kind of beats of the play is him like starting to feel something like remorse
Yeah.
and not knowing how to deal with that at all.
Yeah, there's his journey through all of that is really interesting because I think when Agnetha comes into his story, there it's all monologues until a scene where Agnetha talks to Ralph in one of those visitor rooms. And she is, I bet, one of the first people who doesn't just treat him with disdain and hatred. Like part of one of his earlier monologues is describing what like the police officers or guards or other people have said to him. No one has shown him any compassion.
Mm-hmm.
But Agnetha, when she comes in, she takes an interest in his story in a way that isn't accusatory, but is just curious. So I think that tiny thing sets him up for something what exactly what you described. And then Agnetha tries to get out of him more pieces of his story, and he kind of like he lies. He describes a very different childhood than he actually had, and like Agnetha calls him on it. He doesn't deny that he lied, but Agnetha just says like, that's okay. your childhood is also private. And he says, yes, it is. Um, but then one of the very next scenes is Nancy coming to visit him. And he actually admits to Nancy a couple of the things that happened to him. Um, so it just like, it's this, Jackson said it so beautifully, like this teeing up of, like even being able to like say, here are some of the things that I went through. And for him to be able to access his own childhood pain, Nancy then says, all right, if you understand that you were hurt, do you see that you hurt my little one? You hurt Rona.
Yeah.
And he finally is able to see that he hurt Rona, and he starts to cry, and he doesn't know what to do about it. He like rubs his eyes fiercely, and like he starts freaking out, and tells her to leave, calls her a very bad word, and immediately apologizes for it. And it's one of the first times that like the stage directions say authentically apologizes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But then there was one more piece of this. Oh, right. Agnetha comes to sort of say goodbye. She's headed back to New York. And he starts saying, like, I think I have like lung cancer or something.
Right,
There's this
right.
terrible pain in my chest all the time. And the doctors say that nothing's wrong with me. And Agnetha's like, when did it start? And he says it's when Nancy came to see me. It was right after she came to see me. And Agnetha says, I think you're starting to have access to feeling remorse about the things that you did. And he kind of brushes it off and is like, it's lung cancer.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then one of the next scenes, one of his last monologues is him trying to write an apology letter to Nancy, which like he can't go through. Like it's such a heartbreaking scene because he keeps trying and trying and trying to write this letter, and he can't bear to feel that remorse. So he like writes it and then spits on the letter and then puts it in an envelope and then tears it apart and then tries to put all the pieces back together. It's just like this very
Yeah.
painful back and forth between feeling the remorse and then not bearing to feel the remorse, which I think eventually leads to the total unthaw for him, which is he feels the totality of that remorse and can't bear it. And it leads to his end.
Yeah. Yeah, and in that way you kind of see the three forms or the three ways that the moment of I don't know, it may be a little bit of a stress to say that the moment of forgiveness arrives for him, like his feeling of that remorse, and his ability to still live with himself, stops. He can't move into a moment of forgiveness for himself enough to live even with that remorse. And so you have you have that final scene where he's trying more tactics to try to deal with this remorse. He's trying to work out, he's trying to exert himself, but eventually he can't do it. So you have that. It's just interesting to see the thaw of these three characters from their state of frozenness into a state of awareness of their frozenness, and then the consequences of those things, and see it play out really differently for all three of them.
Definitely.
I'm gonna just kind of pivot us just
Absolutely.
a tad, because we got a little bit of time left, but I wanted to give you just a moment longer to kind of talk about why the show. As we've laid out in our conversation, it's a rough show.
It's a rough show.
It's an important show. It tells an important part of a story that is really important. But yeah, what about this show has drawn you to it for this moment or in moments before as you've interacted with this show?
Yeah. Those sorts of shows, rough shows that tell important stories or stories that we sort of shove away because they're too painful to talk about, are stories that I gravitate towards, just because I think they're too important to stare that pain, that grief, and eventually even forgiveness in the face, I think is something we often tend to not do in everyday life. Some people do. I think we as a society are, in some ways, getting better at that. But so I just think that because it is that sort of a story, it is important, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to offer this. But then also, I'll go back to a little bit of what I mentioned at the beginning, is that the method of storytelling, these monologues that eventually weave together into a story that connects. I don't think there's ever a moment where all three of the characters are in one conversation at the same time. They might all be on stage
Yeah,
at
that's
the
an interesting
same
part.
time.
Yeah.
Hopefully, we can very briefly talk about that before we end here. But to have each character tell their own story to us in very different ways. So one of the things I noticed as I was reading is like when you start with Agnetha, the doctor, and her scenes by herself are so much like she's talking to herself. She talks to herself a lot. We get to see her writing a really angry email to her colleague David, who has just died. All of that, but it's sort of like we get to peek in on her conversations with herself. She's not necessarily breaking the fourth wall.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of just get a little window, and she doesn't just come out and say all of the things that are happening to her. You kind of have to piece it together as you go through her scenes. So that's one way. But then you get to Nancy, who like she just breaks the fourth wall all the time.
Right.
She just like her stories are much more descriptions of the things that have happened to her, her feelings and interpretations of those things. But she's the one who also like all of the other characters in the story who aren't characters you see on stage, like her husband Bob, her daughter Ingrid, her mom, whose name I've forgotten, the grandma of the family, even Rona briefly. You get all of those other characters because she quotes her conversations with them. So like she sort of represents this larger community of people that this crime has impacted. So she just has like these multitudes of stories in her that she actually communicates to you. Where like with Agnetha's story, you kind of have to like take little tweezers and go like, okay, I think that was an important thing, and what about that? We're gonna hopefully learn more about that later. But Nancy just like lays it all out on the table for you. She doesn't hold anything back. And then you get to Ralph, who I almost don't even know what to say about his stuff. Like he sort of does break the fourth wall, but it's almost as if he's talking to himself.
Yeah.
It's because Nancy, when she's describing things, she knows you might have a different interpretation of the thing than she does. But Ralph's monologues are more like, let me explain to you why I did this, or like, of course it was this way, don't you see? It's I don't know, his things are just it's so fascinating. He interrupts himself all the time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's in his monologues you can kind of see the brokenness and trauma in his brain, even if he can't.
Mm-hmm.
In those moments, and I just really love that sort of storytelling, to have each of these people get to tell their story in their own very different way, and we as an audience get to interact with them in each a very different way. I just think that's a really cool storytelling method. This play is like both sort of a feminine plot structure and a male masculine plot structure.
Mm-hmm.
Like there is technically an overarching story, but also there's all this other stuff going on at the same time. There's sort of a climax, but not exactly a climax. It's a little beautifully all over the place.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, and that is very particular of Lavery's style of playwriting. And the way that I think you're right on with kind of talking about how this way that these characters get to tell their story is so special. It's one of the really cool things about theater, and why this play takes full advantage of what theater can offer in terms of them telling their story.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, in the monologues. Yes, in the way that they are written to kind of make you wonder whether they're talking to you or whether they're talking to themselves, or what degree of fourth wall breaking is happening. And then also the ways that they very theatrically use each other. I imagine this is a very imaginative play to try to block,
Mm-hmm.
because just there's the opportunity that all three of them are on stage throughout the play.
Mm-hmm.
There's the opportunity that's two of them are on at a time, one of them are on at a time. There's some specificity called for in that. We know for sure that scenes where they're talking to each other, people are on stage at the same time, but also that like there's a scene where Agnetha is doing a presentation before, like we know that she's in some sort of conference hall, but she crosses into Ralph's space to like illustrate what she's talking about.
Mm-hmm. It's so cool.
Really, yeah, it's a really cool scene, and something that yeah, it's a very theatrical scene, but then draws those two characters together in a moment that they're not together, but you experience them together in each other's context for that moment still.
One of the other things, this isn't why I chose this play, but just another thing that I think is really notable about this play is it's very Greek in the way that almost none of the violence is shown on stage
Yeah.
until you get to Ralph's suicide at the end. That's the only bit of violence that actually occurs on stage. And I imagine you could make choices about not even having that happen on stage. But like, the thing that happens at the very beginning of the play is you get the context for the moment that Ralph abducts Rona, the little girl. You get Agnetha telling, like, here's all the things that happen, and I've sent Rona out to bring these gardening shears back to her grandmother, and she's been gone a while. And there's a sound cue in the middle of that for you to hear a van screeching. And then it cuts to Ralph talking about his leg hurting and needing to take the edge off, and then he starts talking to another person who you don't see. We I think assume that the person he's talking to is Rona. So you get parts of his conversation with Rona. You get the lead up to what we know is a truly terrible act, but it stops before we witness anything. It's just enough so that we know what's about to happen, and I just think that's a really interesting way to parallel all of these ways that these characters are telling their stories. That again, with Nancy, she is so often recounting things that have happened to her. You don't often see those things happen to her. She is just telling you about them after they've happened. And that is sort of kept as a theme, even with the really hard things, most of the really hard physical things in this play too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. The way that kind of mirrors their journey is yeah, that's well put. Of like, yeah, the sort of like visceralness of their story is one that is talked about but not shown in a lot of sort of scenarios. So, yeah. We're getting near to the end of our time on this podcast, but I would be remiss and I would rob our no script folks of the chance to have you weigh in just on the poetry of this. And we've done it a little bit already, but I wanted to be sure to give you a moment to talk about, because This play it has a very interesting structure on the page, as you kind of talked about at the beginning. And in addition to a theater artist, you're also a poet. And just love to hear how the the formatting of this play, all the poetry of this play, the way the lines are written affect the way the story is delivered.
Yeah. I think Lavery uses a couple tours tools particularly well. And they show up in some people's speech more than others. She uses things like capitalization. There's a bunch of times when Nancy's talking where every word will begin with a capital letter in whatever sentence she's
Mm-hmm.
or yeah. every word in a sentence will begin with a capital letter, and you kind of have to decide how are those things being emphasized, which is interesting because a lot of other tools for emphasis also happen. Lavery also uses italics as that. She uses ellipses, often when there's sort of this interruption happening in a person's thought, or that's more of like a trailing off. But also she uses line breaks as a sort of a tool, both for trailing off, but just like almost a can't bear to finish the sentence sort of a thing.
Yeah.
And to have all of those pieces there for the benefit of the actor who is interpreting how these words might be spoken, I just think is so helpful, and it's a gift that the audience doesn't get, right? But it invites the actors to have a different relationship with these words, to think differently about how this character feels about their own words. Like I said earlier, Ralph interrupts himself a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And one other thing that Lavery uses, I think, really powerfully is repetition. With Ralph, there's a couple phrases that it's again sort of like he's stuck with these certain phrases. He says obviously a lot. But there was one moment that I caught this time. I don't think I caught it the last time that I read the script, which was several years ago, and I don't think I caught it. I actually have seen this produced on stage by a very small theater company, so everything you said in the beginning
Hey.
is true. It is very producible. You just dialect work and being okay with the subject matter, are kind of the biggest hurdles. But there's this really beautiful moment. I think this all happens during the first act, where there are these parallels that happen. It's in Nancy's story. It's many years after Rona has been missing, and she hasn't yet found out what has happened to her, and she's stuck in that space of, are we ever going to know what happened to her? Is she going to just show up at the house someday and say, Mom, here I am. Hi, Mom, it's me. Yeah, Mom, it's me, I think is what she says. Like she paints this picture for the audience of how she imagines this happening. And she, at this point, you know that she has created this entire organization dedicated to finding children who go missing. And she has just gone through this very powerful speech to all of her organization folks about how the work is important and it matters because they just found and reunited a boy who had been missing for like 13 years with his parents. But then you get this moment of her saying, here is how I long for Rona to come back to me. And then she doesn't get that. She's told by the police that they've found her remains. But one thing we didn't get to talk about a lot, which why I won't talk too much about, but is her relationship with her other daughter,
Yeah.
Ingrid. Ingrid goes on her own grief journey, talks about dreams she's had, kind of goes through an emotional eating phase, but then in the midst of one of the things, it's after they found out what happened to Rona, she says to her mom, I'm going to go abroad and I just need to be gone for a while. Nancy's kind of mad about that, doesn't understand. But then you get this moment where she's in the midst of her own grief and anger at Ralph about all the things that he's done. And Ingrid shows up at the house in exactly the way that she has described Rona coming home. And she says, Mum, it's me.
Yeah.
So I just think that the way these tiny little parallels and larger parallels, but like there are these parallels that happen in the language, in told moments in this script that are at their heart very poetic, because I think that's one of my favorite things. My favorite tools in poetry is that use of repetition that becomes a turn. It may have started this one way, but by the time we repeat it, you are invited to think about it or experience it in a totally different way. And I just think that's so powerful about this script in particular.
We're alas at the end of our time for this particular podcast, and there is so much more that we can talk about.
There's so much more.
Like Ingrid is such an interesting storyline. I'm glad that you brought her up at the very end there. She's also the one that has the dream about like the ice flow and the cracking sounds. That we could talk about the technical aspects of the show with. There's a number of sound cues where like ice cracking is one of those things that are called for.
Yep.
So much stuff in there.
One other thing that we didn't get to talk about that we won't talk about, but you should know that it's there. There's a guard that shows up on stage, and there's only 3 actors.
Yeah.
What do you do with the fact that like, why is that guard there? Why is it? Why can't we mime that guard? And you should go read the script and talk to Jackson and Jacob about why you think that guard is there, because I have thoughts that I'm not going to share with you right now, but talk to them.
Oh man, well, give it just a little bit. It's
Okay.
the guest episode. Give us your thoughts at least, and then we'll pass it on to everyone else.
Okay. So you only have these 3 characters, or three actors, and Lavery has chosen to make this guard a tangible character on stage in scenes where Agnetha is talking to Ralph, and then later when Nancy is talking to Ralph. You aren't told to have another person play that guard, so the only option is for the actor who's not actively involved in the scene to be that guard. The only option, the most immediate, a prominent option. There's never an only option in theater, but to see during those scenes with Agnetha and Ralph, Nancy is playing the guard, watching over their conversation, is odd and also very powerful for there to be this these other presences in the room, which like their faces we might associate with these other storylines, but the one time that I saw it, they each totally dressed up in like very obvious guard uniforms so that you didn't mistake them for representing their own character, but like that's still the actor playing Nancy.
Right.
I know that. I see that. And those guards have previously been described as these really violent, powerful, or potentially violent, powerful forces in Ralph's story. So to have those being the only moments when all 3 actors are in one scene at the same time is just like, ugh, making those other storylines, those sort of powerful and potentially violent forces. I just think it's so cool.
Yeah. That is fascinating to think about. And fortunately, we can continue to
Yeah.
think about it as Hannah's already advocated. If you want to keep chatting about this play, you can do so. Though the conversation has ended on this particular podcast episode, we'd love to extend the conversation out to all of you out there in podcast land. If you have seen this play, read this play, been a part of this play in any way, just enjoyed the conversation and heard something that you want to chat about with someone else who has read this play, we're the folks to do that with, and the greater No Script listener base. All of you, we need to come up with a name for you all eventually. Are great folks to do that with as well. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at the username at No Script Podcast. We also have a Gmail, noscriptpodcast@gmail.com. Find us on any of those sites, but especially the social media sites, because we'd love to keep having this conversation with you, and we would love to extend the conversation out to the whole community as well. Additionally, if you've enjoyed this conversation, if you've enjoyed any of the conversations that No Script has had this season, we're coming down to the end of our season here, and it's been a pretty fun one, at least for me. I want to say it's been a great one, but that's ultimately up to you all to decide. It's been fun for me. We love it if you have enjoyed the show, if you could share it around with people that you know like scripts, people that you know like theater, people that you know like talking about theater. We're hosted on Podbean, we're on iTunes, we're on Google Play, we're on Spotify, we're on a lot of places, a lot of things. So you can follow us on any of those sites. We also post the link directly to Facebook every Monday when we release the show. So share around those links and options for folks who are engaging with the show for the first time. Y'all are great at doing that already, and it's part of making this show continue to happen. So thank you all so much for that. And thank you, Hannah, for coming on the show as the special guest for this season.
Absolutely. It's been a deep pleasure. And thank you guys for letting me pitch the script for this week and saying yes. I had a lot of fun today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much for bringing it. Is there anything that you want to pitch for people? Do you want anyone to come and find you somewhere, or are you doing any work online right now with either theater or poetry or something?
Yeah. I think if you are interested in reading some of the things that I write, one of the easiest ways to find me is by looking up Wayfolk Arts on Instagram. It's a group that I am a part of that posts tiny little written pieces regularly. We create some really fun things. Jackson also happens to be among that community. And I'd love for you to come and check out my work over there. Again, that is at Wayfolk Arts on particularly Instagram. And it's WAYFOLKARTS.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Head on over and check that out. Thanks again for being on the show.
Yeah.
Next week, we're doing our last episode of the season. So don't worry, it's not the last episode of the show or anything. We're at 10 seasons and we're still going strong. But we are going to take our kind of typical summer break after next episode. But the next episode, Jacob will return. And he and I will have our final conversation of season 10 of No Script, the podcast. But until that next week, when we are talking about another script, I'm Jackson Nickolay.
And I'm Hannah Barker Nickolay.
Thank you for listening to No Script, the podcast.